Hey, this is Steve with Dabble Lab, and this is the sixth video in a series that is talking about building Amazon Alexa skills using Node.js. And in this video, we're going to build an entire skill using the Alexa Skills Kit CLI and the Alexa Skills Kit SDK for Node.js in the latest version, which is version 2.0. And up until this point, we actually haven't done any skill building. We've only looked at Node and JavaScript topics, and so this is going to be the first one of the series that we actually build a skill in. And we're going to be using the topics that we talked about earlier, so I'll mention those as I'm going here, but we're not going to go into a lot of detail on those topics. So if any of this isn't making sense to you, take a look at the earlier videos and it should make sense. Okay, so for starters, we're going to use the command line interface, the Alexa Skills Kit. So it's ask and then new. And I'll also leave a link. I did a tutorial on installing and configuring the CLI. And so it is prompting me for a name, and we're going to create a skill called Worthy Advice. And this is going to be a really simple skill that just gets a random quote. And so it's going to we're going to create a local module that uses a community module to call an API to get a random quote, and then we're going to read that back to the user. So pretty simple, but illustrates some points that we talked about earlier that will hopefully make it worthwhile. So now we have our skill project here called Worthy Advice that the CLI created for us, and I haven't gone into this a lot, so I'll talk about it for just a second here, at least not in the tutorial for Node. I talked about it in some other videos, but when I did the Ask New, there's a kind of a boilerplate skill that's created here in the Lambda folder, Lambda custom, and this is just kind of your typical hello world skill, but this is using the new SDK, and we're gonna modify this. So what I'm gonna do is just walk through kind of how I would normally go at this. I create a file that I use as sort of a test harness. Normally I would do this with something like Mocha or Chai, which are unit testing tools for Node, but we haven't covered those topics yet, so I'm going to do it a little bit differently. What I'm doing here is I'm just setting up a file that I can use to test my module that I'm going to be creating. And so that's what I'm going to go to next. I'm going to create a new folder called modules to hold my local modules that I'm going to create, and I'm going to create my first local module. I'm going to call this one quote helper. Oops. And in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using some third-party modules, some community modules, and I'm going to be using one called request, and then there's actually the one I'm going to be using is called request promise, because I want to make a remote request, but I want to have it returned as a promise object. So first I'm going to install request, because request promise requires that. And next, I guess I can just do this because it's the same thing. Next, I'm going to install request promise. And so these are the two community modules that I'm going to be using. And really, I'm using the request promise, but it depends on that request module. So I need to install them both. And I can go in here and see that those two are installed like we talked about in the earlier video. And now in here, I need to just require the request promise, which I'll call, what do I call it, RP. And then, there we go. All right, and like I said, what I'm gonna do is really just set this up to call an API that's going to get a remote, call a remote API to get a random quote, and it's this one that I found that I Googled, and this is the endpoint I'm going to be calling, and this just returns this here, this JSON JavaScript object here, and there's three properties. There's a quote property, an author property, and a cat for category. And we're going to use the quote and the author. We won't use the category now, although I guess we could let the user ask for a quote by category, but we're not going to do that for right now. We're just going to keep it simple. And so what I'm going to do for this is recall from the previous videos, we're going to be exporting a module. So I need to give it a name, and I'm going to call it quote helper. And set that to an empty object for right now. And then so that is, I'm going to go quote helper, and then I'm going to just say get quote as my function. And then this is going to be really simple because of the request promise object. I'm going to just be returning a promise, which is going to be from the request promise. So request promise, and then here they just, they just need the URL, which I need to grab from over here. So this is the URL that I need. And yeah, that's it. Can't get any simpler than that, I don't think. Looks right. And so then for my temp, the reason I set up this file again is so that I can use it to test without having to deploy. And there's a much better way to do this, but we haven't talked about testing yet, so I'm going to do it this way. But in a later video, I'll get into a more elegant way to test while you're doing the development. But this will work for what we're trying to do right now. So in here, I need the need to import that module, require that module. And then it's a local module, so I use the extension when I'm referencing local modules just because it reminds me that it's local. I guess I could look at the folder here, but I do that out of habit. And then I'm going to now just create a function in here that I'm going to use to basically make this call or use the quote helper that we just created. And I'm going to be using the async and await keywords to do this because we're returning a promise. And again, I'm not going to get into that because we covered it in the earlier videos, but just so you know what's going on here. And I'm going to call this test mod for a test module. Not a very great name. But it works, and I don't need any parameters because I'm just so and then in here I'm gonna use my await keyword, and I'm gonna await quote helper and the get quote, and then in here I'm gonna then function and that. And I guess I should also look for an error. This, and yeah, that will do it, and we'll keep this simple. Let me see. I need my return value here. And we'll just like write this out to the console. And actually, I think this gets returned as a string. So let's do this. Cool. I'm going to just parse that value into a JSON object and get the quote property. And then I'm going to use that as my, that's what I'm going to log back here. And then if there's an issue, I'll just log out. And that looks good. And then down here, we'll just do test mod. Okay, so this is my just like really generic test framework here, test harness. So we can try this out. And see if we get, yep. So we got our random quote back. Try it one more time. Okay, all of this looks good. So my my local module seems to be working as expected, and I'm getting that random quote from this API endpoint here. It's all tested. Now that I know this is working, my next step would be to go wire it into my skill, and I'm just gonna, like I mentioned earlier, modify what's provided by the CLI and the boilerplate stuff. And so what's going on here is there's, and if you've looked at this before, in code that's using the earlier SDK, it's a little bit different, this newer one, but you can kind of follow it. We'll get into this in more detail in some later tutorials or later videos in this tutorial. But what's happening is there's a launch request handler that is the handler that's used when somebody says, Alexa, open whatever the skill name is, whatever the invocation name is. And in this case here, it's just responding back with this, welcome to the Alexa Skills Kit. You can say hello, and then if you say hello, it responds with hello world. So really simple example, but what we're going to do is we're going to just change this up so that when you say Alexa open whatever worthy advice, actually that reminds me we should change the invocation name. So the default invocation name for the template that's provided is greeter, and I'm going to change this to advice like that. Oops, where'd I go? All right. And so what I want to do here is I want to use my module, my quote helper module here to return a random quote. And so I'm going to use the async and await keywords that we talked about in the last video, just so we can take advantage of those. We're using in the new AWS Lambda, or the latest runtime version supported by AWS, which is new for, it's not new for Node, but it's new in the Lambda world, but it supports 8.10. So we can use the async and await keywords. So I'm going to use that for this here. And I am going to basically, let's see, how can I do this? I'll change this to let, and then whoops. So I'll set the default value to I don't have a quote, and then we're gonna await our, wait a second, I didn't, I need this module, the one that we just created. equals okay. So I've got my quote helper here, and so I want to quote helper. Let's see, get quote, I think, yeah. And then I want to then, and here I'm going to do my function and the value, return value, and then this, and then I should probably deal with the error here also. So we'll do that. And again, this is stuff that we looked at in the earlier videos. But now here for my speech text, I'm going to set that to something there. Oops. And here, I'm going to set it to an error. And up here, I want to return my quote, which is going to come back in this value. So change this to do something like, oh, actually, I need to parse that, right? So let quote equal JSON.parse value dot quote, right? Yeah, so that's going to be my quote. And then I'm going to use that in my response text, my speech text, and I'll do that by just saying here's a quote, and maybe I should also do the author. So I'll say here is a quote from author. That. All right, that looks good. And okay. I think I need to await this too. Actually, I'll try it without it and see what happens, and then we'll come back. I think I do though. And I don't need a reprompt because I'm not asking for any follow-up response. And I guess we can leave the card in there. We'll just say, change this to random quote. I think I need to await this, but I'm not sure. Let's try it. So I'm going to go back over here and then use the CLI to deploy this. And this takes a minute. So this is pushing out the Lambda function and the model. It's going to build the model and do all of the configuration in the Alexa portal. So this is going to take a minute. I'm going to pause and then come back and we can see if it's working. Okay, now everything is deployed and looks like it was successful. I get a message back here telling me now that I can test the skill by just saying, Alexa, open your invocation name, which in our case here is worthy advice. And then I also get the option here to use the simulate command, the ask simulate command. And I'm not going to do either of those. We'll talk about using simulate and testing with the CLI in another video. But I'm going to just go out to the developer console and test in here so we can see what's going on and hear it. So here's the skill that we just created that's deployed. And if I go in here to edit, well, test is really what I want. Looks, everything's good there. So I want to go test over here, and I just want to try to use the launch request. So open, and then the skill name, which is worthy advice, and see if it's working.
Here is a quote from Aristotle. Those who educate children well are more to be honored than they who produce them, for these only gave them life. Knows the art of living well.
Okay, so it is all working, all went well. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. So real simple example, nothing too fancy, but we got an opportunity to look at some topics that we talked about in the earlier videos. So specifically using community modules with the request module and the request promise module. And then we used promises, which we talked about earlier, in the async and await keywords, which we talked about, and then creating local modules with our quote helper. So we, with this simple example, we covered a lot of ground, at least in terms of what we've talked about up to this point. And then in a future video, we'll talk more about testing and a better workflow for, like, this was a really simple one. So not that difficult to stay on top of, but as you start working on more complex skills, the testing workflow becomes pretty important. So we'll cover that in a later video, but hopefully this was helpful. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those and I will reply just as soon as possible. If you did find the video helpful, please like it and subscribe to the Dabble Lab channel. Thanks so much.